Okay, so the reason that I've written the paragraph out above is because this is really, really important. So I want you to really focus on the words and make sure that you understand what is the essence of social identity theory, because what it's really saying is that we don't vote, or parties don't compete for our vote because they have issues that we're interested in, or we pursue the issues that we're interested in. This sort of perspective is actually saying voting is personal. And so while this idea has been around since probably sort of the 1990s, at least in a kind of formal sense, and that there's a book on the reading list, Partisan Hearts and Minds, and this is sort of setting out some of the first initial ideas along this, but it is making a bit of a comeback in recent times, particularly if we think of more current or recent political competition. In the US last year, we had Trump. We see the rise of the right all over Europe, and of course, sort of grassroots movements coming to the fore, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. All of these political movements or political competitions based really on identity terms. Now, there are a couple of ways we can treat identity in the theory of voting in elections. On the one hand, and this is really the way that I've treated identity in this part of the lecture, and that is to see social identities as deriving their power from the sort of emotional satisfaction that they generate for the members of these identities, of these social groups, by virtue of the bonds of belonging. So in this sense, identity voting is really, it's an expressive act, and it has its roots in expressive rather than instrumental reason. But on the other hand, it is of course possible to model identity as perfectly instrumental, where social identity is a kind of simplifying mechanism to, let's say, reduce uncertainty about the world. And so social identities here are really epiphenomenal and are really adopted in the pursuit of material self-interest. So in the expressive view, social identities have meaning because of their substantive content. In the instrumental view, they derive meaning from their usefulness. Now, why is this distinction important for us in PH 336? Well, it's important for, I would say, three big reasons. And this kind of relates back to some of the content that we studied in week one. So first, if you think about votes as a reflection of our identity and how we see ourselves, and that the expression of our identity through voting is emotional rather than instrumental, then we have a bit of a problem trying to accommodate identity in a rational choice model of voting in elections. So if our preferences don't operate in formally predictable ways, so sort of as in the case of expressive reason or expressive voting, then modelling voting by way of a utility function makes no sense whatsoever. Secondly, even if we do treat identity in a kind of instrumental way, the question that quickly follows is, where do our identities come from in the first place? So remember, in our standard economic model, our preferences are fixed, but of course our various identities can be primed at different given moments. So, our identities can be more, or some of our identities can be more prominent than others in different times and different spaces. So they're not fixed necessarily, they can be primed and they can be switched on and off at different times and places. But we also know that from the political psychology and behavioural economics literature that these kind of primed identities aren't necessarily just fleeting, they can also endure. So, for instance, by identifying as an economist and hanging out with other economists, my preferences can actually change so that I can become more of an individualist, say. So this kind of brings structure in. So it brings structure into the picture, and it poses problems for methodological individualism, and that is what the economic approach to voting in elections is based on. So again, we're kind of bringing in these methodological issues. And lastly, I just want to think about the social categories to which we might identify. So going back to Tony Lawson from from week one, and we think about these social categories, have a little think about this. But do you think these categories are likely to reflect a system that is closed? So that is, we know when category X is switched on, we end up with outcome Y. Or do you think the system of social categories is actually more likely to be an open system, where we are always all that we are at all times, and identity is both conscious, latent, and perhaps it's even unimagined, so unknown unknowns. So there are many possibilities, if not an infinite number of possibilities, of which identity and which subsequent political behaviour will actually materialise. And remember, we talked in the seminar about how the interaction of causal mechanisms can in fact be transformative in Lawson's view. So let's say I'm a feminist and I'm a Green, but does the combination of these two social categories actually combine to create something entirely different from its two constituent parts? So is, I'm going to say, green feminism something different than green plus feminism? And if that is the case, so if these categories are actually transformed when they're mixed, the endeavour of prediction will be pretty futile.
So I think another important implication of this, and this sort of comes out of the psychology literature, is the sort of expressive nature of partisanship is going to have implications for the way that partisans behave. So when we're thinking about partisans as members of some kind of social group, they're going to want to emphasize, or they're going to want to give some kind of positive social identity to their group. But of course, if they're given positive social identity to their own group, this has to be in relation to an outgroup. So we get this kind of in-group, out-group dynamic going on. So it's a kind of in-group identification and potentially an out-group discrimination. And so this is sort of a kind of psychological explanation for what is perhaps going on in the States and then in Europe, and the rise of kind of populist right parties.
Or even Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. So you see parties kind of appealing to sort of emotive rhetoric in their campaigns for our votes. And if this is linked to identity, then we might see political competition based on fear, anxiety, anger, directed towards outgroups, and enthusiasm or sort of approach emotions towards in-groups. And this really sort of allows political leaders to say what the hell they like, say wild, wacky things that, don't make much sense. But what they are doing really underneath that is appealing to a certain group of folks and saying, I am like you, trust me, be scared of them. And for me at least, this seems to be what we see quite frequently in politics today. But this is just musings from my brain, and this is a class. So what we're going to do next is have a little look at some evidence, and I think this is quite a nice paper. Again, it's not a whole picture of what's going on, but hopefully it sheds some light on the interactions in sort of an applied setting. So that's where we'll go next.